You know, the talk about corruption across the continent and even around the world is something that resonates more with those around the continent. It was Pope Francis who said, "The poor pay for corruption." And of course, Nigeria's former finance minister and now the Director General of the World Trade Organization, in her book, she said, fighting corruption is dangerous. So, are we treading on a dangerous path today on Village Square? Because that's what we're looking at. How well can Africa and Africans fight corruption? Welcome, I'm Sulaiman. You know, corruption for decades has been Africa's foremost enemy. Political office holders have often been caught in the act, with the highest officers to the lowest homes all found wanting in this endemic practice that threatens the development of this blessed continent. Now, from north and south of the Sahara, money is taken abroad, not for development, but for keeps, and the devastation at home is ever-growing, with Africans wallowing in increasing abject poverty, unemployment, insecurity, and fighting tooth and nail with a lack of basic amenities. Corrupt African leaders and individuals across spheres take money abroad for the acquisition of choice properties. Now, the leaders are in the public glare and make headlines, but the man taking a bribe to do his job is hardly seen or caught in the act. From the family to the public service, private companies, and even charity organizations and religious places. Yes, corruption is bedeviling Africa and threatening the common good of the people. Now, how can corruption be fought? That's why we're here today in Village Square, Africa. Now, we have a packed house today to unravel the mystery behind the fight against corruption. David Lewis, Executive Director, Corruption Watch South Africa, and Prince Francis Chilake, a political analyst, joins me now. And later on the show, we'll have Professor Mashufie Herbert, Professor of Public Affairs, the Tshwane University of Technology, South Africa, and Oluwadare Kolawole, the Deputy Director of Socioeconomic Rights and Accountability Project, SERAP, will join me on the other half. But now, quickly, welcome, David and Chilake. Let me start with you, David. Corruption in South Africa can be traced back to the apartheid period now. Just recently, we've started seeing some big names, even a former president being asked to come answer to some questions. How significant is the understanding of events of corruption in South Africa, talking about the fight of corruption in South Africa?
Hi, Sulaiman. I think, one of the things that South Africa has got going for it in the fight against corruption, and there are not a lot of things, but one thing they've got going for themselves is, or that we've got going for ourselves, is that I think that people are aware of corruption and they are outraged by it, and they haven't yet, I hope, will not yet, accepted that it's a tax that they simply have to pay, as I think in some countries has been the case. So I think South Africans are aware of it. As you said at the beginning, how to fight it is not easy, but you can't fight it if people are not aware of it and if they're not outraged by it. And as I say, I think what we have going for us is that South Africans are aware and they are still outraged. They have not accepted it as a way of life that simply they can do nothing about.
I think awareness is big in this whole fight against corruption, as you've just highlighted, David. We'll come back to you and expatiate more on that. Let me go to Nigeria, come back to Nigeria rather, where Chilake is. What's the first step in the fight against corruption? Because listening to David, he said something, the people can't buy in if they're unaware of what corruption is, so that they can better understand when they see a corrupt act.
Well, I think I'm going to take a cue from where David stopped. And I will say precisely that Nigerians as people have not come to terms with what corruption is. We have a society that's built on materialism, and any society that is built on materialism is bound to be corrupt. And the people are not yet conscientized, they're not yet aware, they're not yet informed as to what corruption is, where it starts and where it ends. Because what you have playing out in Nigeria is where the people themselves, who are supposed to speak up against corruption, are the ones speaking in favor of corruption. Because you just have a situation where people are too eager, too willing to praise, worship a man who they don't even understand his source of income. So it's going to take a lot of fight for us to really get to the point of where we say, yes, we're ready to fight corruption. And it starts with us eliminating materialism in our lifestyle.
Let me go to South Africa again, to David. Let's stretch this because you actually started off on the issue of knowledge or information, which Chilaka here in Nigeria has also said, he's also towing that line. How can Africans, now speaking broadly, get this awareness? Because it would seem as if sometimes, unconsciously or consciously, in some parts of the continent, those who are enmeshed in corruption are, placed on a high pedestal and reverenced by the same people who should know that that's actually a bad act.
Yeah, I don't find that sort of placing, as Francis has said, that placing of corrupt people on pedestals has really happened. I mean, there are very corrupt people who have an enormous amount of political support and public support, often from interest groups that they have favored with their patronage. I mean, I think our former president, Jacob Zuma, is one of those. But I don't find that ordinary people revere those who they know have achieved what they've achieved by corrupt means. In fact, very often they dislike people who've achieved great wealth even by non-corrupt means. Our organization, our little NGO, is mostly devoted to public education and public mobilization. And so we maintain as high a profile as we can in the media, for example. We produce lots of reports. We engage in a lot of public discussion. And while I'm not claiming for one instance that we are responsible for the high level of consciousness about corruption, I think the fact that we and a number of other civil society organizations have done this, and the fact that we have a reasonably independent media has contributed enormously to the fact that people know about corruption. There's an enormous amount of media coverage and interest in it, both investigative media and reportage. And so there's a lot of public conversation about corruption. And when I'm asked to identify the successes of our organization, the one that I would claim is our contribution to keeping this public conversation going, because it has to be kept going. And that has to be accompanied, it's not only is it a conversation, but it's a conversation that educates. So we publish stuff about corruption in the mining sector, or corruption in public procurement, or corruption in healthcare, which is very topical and prevalent at the moment. We name and shame people. We name and fame people who have resisted corruption. And so it's just a matter of really keeping this pot of public conversation and public education boiling all the time, which is what we and others, similarly placed to us, attempt to do. And as I say, with the enormous assistance of the media.
Well, no doubt. I think there's been some tremendous work by Corruption Watch in South Africa. And I think some of these you've highlighted, even though you haven't actually put it, as some of the gains you've recorded. I come to Nigeria, Chilaka, listening to David, some of the key things. I picked for one thing, he said they just don't only name and shame, For those who have resisted corruption or corrupt acts like taking a bribe and being enmeshed in corruption have also been named and famed. Make them very popular, let people know about them. Do you think in Nigeria, similar bodies, are any different from what Corruption Watch South Africa is doing?
Yes, we have quite a number of organizations that are, talking about corruption, trying to get people to condemn corrupt acts and all of that. We have government institutions that are meant to fight corruption. But the question is, how well placed and how well informed and how much political will does the government itself have to ensure that whoever has been pointed out as being corrupt is, punished. You see, you need to understand that corruption is a family issue and materialism is a society issue. So you have these two things working hand in glove. So when they are working hand in glove, it's difficult because corruption, for instance, has gotten into the schools, and that is why you have lecturers, selling handouts, sex for grades, cash for grades, high tuition fees and all of that. Corruption has also gone into governance. And that's where you have, inflated budgetary, padded budgetary, inflated contracts, and all of that. It has also gone into religion, where you have, prosperity gospel, you have people selling prophecies, prophesying here and there, you have people praying for people who they know are corrupt. So if we really want to fight corruption, for instance, in Nigeria, we need to be ready to have the political will to make hard laws. And the laws we should make are laws that are not, meant for a particular group of people. We must make laws that have no respect for anybody who has been found to be corrupt. And so these laws must be such that it's either you're going to jail for a long time or actually maybe we should have laws where people are sentenced to death for corruption. Because, you see, when you talk about corruption, you find out that it's not just what you do that is corrupt, but the fact that it affects many lives down the line. If you're a contractor and you're giving money to build, a hospital, and you embezzle the money and you don't build a hospital, people will suffer. So we must have laws that hold such people responsible, and these laws must not be solely for one group of people, but laws that everybody in Nigeria must be ready to obey. So the government needs to have the political will to do that. And until we wake up and rise up to that situation, we cannot really say we're fighting corruption in Nigeria.
I'll come back to specifics, David. But for now, David, listening to both of you, I want to ask how challenging is the fight against corruption, knowing that you actually, beaming your searchlight on very influential persons, especially?
It's very challenging, and I think it's one of those frustrating battles that are never quite won. You never quite eradicate corruption. You maybe get it down to manageable proportions, but as long as there are human beings with unequal access to vast resources, there is going to be some measure of corruption. I mean, the problem in South Africa is that it's gotten out of hand. It's reached unmanageable proportions. And for all I hear about Nigeria, I believe, you face a similar problem. And so we've got to bring it down to proportions that are manageable. And I mean manageable by the government, manageable by the law enforcement authorities, managed by society. I mean, we're in the middle at the moment of a commission of inquiry that is exposing the most extraordinary level and extent of corruption. And, this is having to some extent, the paradoxical effect of making people, firstly believe that corruption may be even worse than it is, but secondly, becoming, despondent about how to deal with it. And I think, the people have got to be told the truth. People have got to be messaged correctly. Francis has just said things which remind me of the importance of trying to message people at the local level. You know, you read a lot in the newspapers and see a lot on television about our electricity authority or our transport authority or our police. We don't hear enough on those kind of platforms about day-to-day corruption that is experienced by ordinary people in ordinary places of residence and work. And these are the kind of things that people respond to and that make them really understand what corruption is. And in the end, you know, I think that Francis is right. Or maybe you said this at the beginning of the program, it's the poor who pay for it. I mean, immeasurably so. It's not the leafy suburbs who are the quickest to complain about the corrupt new government or old government or whatever the case may be, but they generally don't rely on public goods. It's those who have to rely on public health, public transport, public security, it's public housing. It's those who experience the burden of corruption most powerfully, and one's got to message them and not only talk about corruption that involves hundreds of millions of dollars. You talk about corruption that on the face of it is very small, but is enormously impactful on the life of ordinary people.
And Chilaka, you know, the thing here is that, recall we also made mention of our former finance minister in Nigeria, who at the moment is the Director General of the World Trade Organization. I'm quite sure you must have seen the book she wrote on fighting corruption, which she did say is quite dangerous. So listening to David and yourself, the first thing is that what comes to mind is that everyone who is in the fight against corruption first is a hero, known for well is more like a mafia you're fighting against. Tell us how this whole fight, how dangerous, because he's talked about some of the challenges posed in fighting corruption. No doubt, that's a path many wouldn't want to tow, Chilaka.
Well, you know, you see, when we talk about fighting corruption, and then you hear the cliche of that people say, oh, corruption will fight back. The reason why corruption fights back is because the man who inflates a contract doesn't eat the money alone. It spreads. And so if, for instance, somebody defrauds the government for, say, 10 million or 10 billion naira, he shares the money amongst his friends and cronies. And so when you begin to ask him to return the money, in other words, he also has to go back to all those he has given money to return them. And you know how difficult that can be. So that is what it means by corruption fighting back. But see, I can tell you that we can actually address the issue of corruption, especially in Nigeria. And it starts from the homes. It starts from the families. It starts from the churches. It starts from the mosque. People who are into corrupt practices have homes. They go to churches. They go to mosques. They go to town unions and all of that. So why don't we start from there? Why don't we start shaming them from that point? You know, why is it that all the family values have been thrown to the dogs? Why is it that parents are not asking their sons or their daughters question when the child comes back from school and has, book or pen or something you didn't buy as a parent? Why do you accept it? Why is it that when a child that, your son is not working and then he comes home and says, oh, mommy, I've bought a car for you. And you're not asking that child, how did you get the money to buy this car? So the homes have, lost the values. And this is where the major problem lies. Then if you move it into our religious circle, the churches and the mosques, they've also lost it. When you have pastors now praying for 419ers and all of that, praying for politicians they know have not been able to perform after 4 years, 8 years in office. So what are we talking about? So we need to be sincere with ourselves. If we want to fight corruption, we need to go back to the basics. Maybe we need to go back to our African way of life. Maybe we need to go back to the Nigerian way of life, where people swear with their local deities. Maybe that will help to curb corruption in Nigeria.
Well, anyway, let's go deep. Some of the key things, as a news person, some of the things that worries me and worries many Africans is seeing that some past leaders have actually been fingered, especially when they leave office. So, David, what's the significance of the African National Congress's total domination of South African politics to the fight against corruption, as we have seen, lately?
Well, I don't think we solve corruption in South Africa unless we solve the problem that is manifesting itself at the moment as enormous factional division within the African National Congress. In fact, former President Mbeki made exactly that point today in a speech to one of the structures of the ANC. And the ANC has become an enormously divided and corrupted organization. At the moment, the opponents of corruption are marginally on top of the factional divisions, but it's a very unstable organization. It's a very divided organization. Every week we wake up in South Africa thinking that this is going to be the week at which the stuff in the ANC is going to be finally resolved, and it somehow never seems to. And the president of the country, who is also the president of the ANC, in fact, he would not be president of the country were he not president of the ANC, is in an enormously difficult position. I mean, people, he's done, since he became president of the country, he's actually done quite well as president of the country in introducing anti-corruption measures and in making the fight against corruption a sort of key and known element of his government. He hasn't done nearly as well in dealing with the problems in the ANC. Although, in the last couple of months, he has gone sort of head to head with his most powerful opponent in the organization, and I think come out on top. But, I suppose at the back of his mind, and whether it should be or whether it shouldn't be, it's caused an enormous amount of frustration, is that were he to go too visibly against the ANC or against the alternative faction of the ANC and lose the battle, he might find himself out on his ear as president of the country as well. So, to fight corruption, there are a whole lot of issues you have to think about. You have to think about the electoral system. We have an electoral system in South Africa that doesn't hold people accountable. You have to think about the law enforcement institutions. And, even though it's already 25 years since apartheid, we have never quite succeeded in overcoming the lack of trust in the law enforcement authorities. And they have, made good this lack of trust by conducting themselves in the most appalling manner. We have to get our state-owned enterprises right, We have to limit political patronage, which is what ensures that leaders get elected. We have to move away from a situation where it costs millions and millions of rands to stand for high political office. This is not a uniquely South African and not a uniquely Nigerian phenomenon either. But it gets a certain kind of individual and certain kind of practices into becoming current practices and current power. And it doesn't bode well. It doesn't bode well for governance anywhere. I mean, believe you me, not only is this not only a Nigerian and a South African phenomenon or an African phenomenon, it is a global phenomenon. It's not a developing country phenomenon either. And so, a lot has to do with the demise of certain forms of democracy, and practices that are antithetical to, any notion of accountability of government to the people that they are elected to serve, or whose loyalty they have bought, to be perfectly honest, under many circumstances. So it's a very complex fight with lots of dimensions, and one indeed is changing things at the level of the family, at the level of the school. Public education programs of that scale, particularly in a country of the size and complexity of Nigeria, and the complexity and divisiveness of South Africa. These are very difficult behavior change programs to put in place, but I agree with Francis. They are important. I mean, there's no question about it, but they're probably the most difficult battles to fight, actually.
Now that takes us back to you, Francis Chilaka. Listening to David, he stretched it. He said quite a lot, and it resonates with a lot of people have had conversation with on Village Square Africa here. Now, coming to Nigeria, do you think there is a synergy between the separate bodies set up to tackle the problem of corruption in Nigeria? In Nigeria, you have the EFCC, you have the ICPC, and you also have the NFIU.
Well, you see, we have too many bodies fighting corruption in Nigeria, but we need to address certain issues in order to be able to fight corruption. One of the issues we need to address is the electoral system. We need to take a good look at that electoral system. A system that makes you, as somebody who wants to vie for governor or any post, to spend so much money, during the elections. And when you get into power, the first thing you want to do is to recoup back all the money you've spent. That is one. Two, we need to look at the Constitution and look at the powers the Constitution gives to all these bodies that are meant to fight corruption. A situation where you have the executive determining who is going to head EFCC, ICPC, and all of that is also not helping the fight of corruption. We need to have an independent organizations that are fighting corruption, and they must be so independent of the executive, the legislative. We need to have a vibrant judiciary system, because without a vibrant judiciary system, we will not be able to fight corruption. And because most times when people are, arrested or charged to court for corrupt practices, you find out that, somewhere along the line, the judge will throw out the case for want of evidence. So we need to have a system that works devoid of who Mr. President is, devoid of who Mr. Senate President is, devoid of who the Speaker is, and also devoid of who the governors are. Because a constitution that allows, for instance, security vote that is unaccounted for, already that is a flaw in the system. That is corruption on its own. So these are issues, if they are not well addressed, all these bodies you're talking about, EFCC, ICPC, they can really not do much. Because when they get somebody arrested, the procedure, the process, it takes a long time for one person to be convicted. And most times, we know that the Nigerians who are charged for corruption have a way of buying their way out. So
I think there's a glitch there. I actually want... are you back, Francis? Well, it looks like we're having a glitch there on the connection to Francis. Let's quickly go to South Africa and see if we can close up. We're rounding off, David, but before we start asking questions of the key things you would want African countries to start doing in the fight against corruption, I want to bring this quickly here about the state capture, which is very prominent in South Africa, as well as the Gupta family, which is also one accused of practicing such. What factors, should be blamed for such, and does South Africa still stand any such risk going forward into the future?
Well, as I'm sure you're aware, Suleiman, we came through 9 horrible years, and I don't want to blame it on individuals. I mean, there are a whole series of factors that account for why the state was able to be captured in the way it was under the Zuma administration. And one of those is the simple fact that president has, in South Africa at any rate, has the sole unfettered discretion to appoint the head of the police, the head of the Special Anti-Corruption Unit, the head of the National Prosecuting Authority, the head of the South African Revenue Services, the leadership of state-owned enterprises. For some reason, and for all the democracy of our constitution, he has this absolutely unfettered right. And he helped secure the capture of the state by the simple expedient of putting the wrong people in the right places at the wrong time, or whatever the expression is. But basically making sure that each of those institutions were held within his sway by extending patronage to their leadership and protection to their leadership. And for his troubles, they extended protection to him. And, with the African National Congress, patronage was extended to the provincial leaders, in exchange for which they agreed, not formally obviously, but effectively they agreed not to interfere with the president and the Gupta family's looting of national resources. And the provincial leaders had to extend patronage to the local leaders. And so this whole system of corruption and patronage cascaded downwards. But the capture of the principal institutions, and particularly the law enforcement authorities, although I have to say, with the exception of the judiciary, and that's been a particularly weak part of the Zuma strategy for reasons that I still don't fully understand. They've never managed to comprehensively capture the judiciary. And this was an important chink in their armor. But South Africa is not free from the threat of it still. I think it's been seen off for the meantime. But one slip by the current faction in power, and believe you me, they're not without their blemishes themselves, and we'll find ourselves back in that position. And so, we've learned a number of lessons, and this commission of inquiry that I referred to earlier, popularly known as the Zondo Commission, after its chairperson, who's the Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, I'm hoping when they report later in the year, they're going to focus on the lessons that we have learned. And some of them are similar to those that Francis mentioned, like we have too many anti-corruption agencies. Others are maybe more local, like the way in which, as I say, the leadership of our institutions are appointed. Another is the fact that we don't have elected representatives in South Africa. We have representatives chosen by proportional representation. So you don't vote for the leader. If you don't vote for the person you want to see in parliament, you vote for the party. And the result is that they are beholden to the elected leaders are beholden to the party and not to the people who elected them. Now, there are a range of things like that, some technical, some obviously political, that have to be changed, and those lessons have to be learned. But I think one should never relax and imagine that one is immune from the prospect of capture, where literally what happens is that powerful institutions, law enforcement institutions, state-owned enterprises where the big money is and the big procurement budgets are, literally have their boards of directors, their leadership captured and repurposed for those who have captured them, rather than to serve the interests of the public, which they are meant to serve. And no one should relax and imagine that we're not susceptible to that, or anybody is not susceptible to that.
Well, I think it's a fine place for us to leave it. I see Francis is back. Apologies for that, loss in connection to you, Francis. I'm hoping that, listening to both of you tells me one thing. First, David started by saying that the awareness is insufficient, and I'm hoping that journalists, my colleagues, and everyone, we must join in this. Talk more about this. So on the square, we should be, reaching out to David and Francis again, to talk more about the fight against corruption. As David rightly said, you cannot eradicate it, but you can reduce it to the barest minimum. And of course, Francis has also highlighted the things happening in Nigeria. Too many, agencies doing the fight, to the extent that well, there's not enough gains recorded so far, and it's also looking at something that has to do with those people appointed to oversee the fight against corruption. The president, he is calling for an independent, person to make that appointment and also latch this on to the electoral body. Well, it's a fine conversation I've had with both of you. David Lewis, who is the Executive Director, Corruption Watch South Africa, and Francis Chilaka, who is a political analyst and someone who is also very much interested in the fight against corruption here in Nigeria. Many thanks, gentlemen, for speaking with us here on Village Square. Coming up next we have two other Africans who also be looking at these key issues here on the square, and that's the fight against corruption. Stay with us. Well, good to have you back again here on Village Square. We're looking at the fight against corruption on the continent. And of course, security agencies, corporate bodies, individuals, public officers have all been seen with varying degrees of corruption problems. Well, public officials have often been seen asking directly, even indirectly, for bribes. In other situations, members of the public are seen offering money for services they seek. Now, from hospitals to courts, corruption has ridden sub-Saharan African nations. Now, in its 2020 rating of the Corruption Index, Transparency International gave sub-Saharan Africa 32% for its fight against corruption, with at least 4 sub-Saharan African countries in the 20 most corrupt countries in the world. Now, joining me now to continue our look here is Professor Mashubi Harbert. He's a professor of public affairs at the Tshwane University of Technology in South Africa. And of course, Oluwadare Kolawole also joined me. He's the Deputy Director of Socioeconomic Rights and Accountability Project SARAP here in Nigeria. Good to have both of you on the show. Quickly, let me start with you, Oluwadare. SARAP has more or less corruption watchdogs in Nigeria. So how difficult has this been in the face of Nigerian political maneuverings?
Thank you very much, Sulema. I would think that would mean how difficult has the fight against corruption been, as against how difficult has it been for Sarah. Of course, you sum it up pretty nicely. In the absence of political will, fighting corruption in Nigeria, either from the side of the establishment or as a civil society organization, or even as an individual Nigerian citizen, has been very hard. So what we've seen is the various legal frameworks that purport or appear to fight corruption. Even some of those frameworks setting up anti-corruption agencies like the EFCC, the ICPC, and the Nigerian police. But what we've seen on the part of the executive, and I'm going to lay this squarely at the feet of the executive, is so much lip service and so little on ground. And that is certified simply by looking at the rate of the convictions that we've seen, either high profile or just convictions for looters of corruption in Nigeria, and the practical absence of transparency and accountability mechanisms in governance. For instance, how much has been recovered by the so-called Abacha loot over the years from the first administration of President Muhammadu Buhari till now? The government cannot reply. SARAP had sent a freedom of information request to the government, and the government couldn't give us concise details. And we've seen the various avenues that money goes to the private pockets in Nigeria. And instance is security votes, which are paid to nearly all public officers in Nigeria, but principally among them, the governors of the 36 states. This amount, by the way, is not backed by any law, and it gets paid, and it runs to billions of naira. every month. It rivals the amount that is budgeted for security for the army and police in instances. And that goes on all the way.
Let me jump in here, Oluwadare, if you will. Apologies, for butting in, but allow me jump in here because you just touched on something here which resonates or bothers a lot of Nigerians, especially now that Nigeria is at war against insurgents, against terrorists. And you said something about security votes. We reminded our viewers earlier on what Pope Francis did say, that the poor ultimately pays, for corruption. And of course, you also recall what Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala said in the book, how dangerous it is to fighting corruption. For Serap, now, looking at that very aspect you touched on, how far has Serap and other bodies gone in trying to put a finger on security votes? Because this is one issue that worries Nigerians, especially now that the fight against insurgency and terrorism is at its peak.
We can only try, and that is basically by forms of advocacy and public interest litigation. Presently, we have 2 suits pending at the Federal High Court, Abuja. One of them is asking critical details of the president and the governors of Nigeria, how much they've earned and collected as security votes over the years, and to disclose the spending of same. And another suit is challenging the legality of the security votes in itself. Both suits are still pending at the Federal High Court. And expectedly, none of the governors, even the president, did not reply to that question. And that is why we continue in that public interest litigation. And we've also done a lot of advocacy in that regard, writing open letters to the president and all the 36 state governors to scrap this practice. Naturally, one would have expected the National Assembly would have taken this up, but they are also complicit in it as well. And so we can only continue by way of public advocacy and litigation that hopefully will get judgment and something favorable at the end.
We'll come back to you, Oluwadare, because the issue of advocacy is what the Executive Director of Corruption Watch in South Africa, David Lewis, did talk about earlier. He said, information, awareness, sensitization, these are very key things in the fight against corruption. Let me quickly bring in Professor Herbert here, a professor of public affairs, also in South Africa. And good to have you join us tonight, Professor Herbert. Quickly, what do you think of the state capture in South Africa? Now we're talking about fighting corruption on the continent.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you clearly.
Thank you so much for hosting us, and I must apologize for some connection challenges that we had. I the discussion in the metro, but the issue that you are talking about indeed is the issue that also travels us as South Africa, the issue of state capture, that subsequently we even have to establish a commission of inquiry to look into that. That is quite challenging, and much of what is actually coming out of the inquiry is quite shocking. But perhaps we need to go back and try to look at the phenomena of corruption and try to historicize it. Because if you go back, you realize that this phenomena of corruption has always been part of the edifice that shaped the evolution of the state. I mean, in our case as a country, if we are to go back to history, since when Jan van Riebeeck came to South Africa, remember, he wasn't really a squeaky clean fellow. He also had his own issues with the company that sent him to this part of the world to come and colonize us. And also, the Dutch administration wasn't really that much squeaky clean. There were many instances of corruption until 1795, when it came to an end and the British over. Also during the British administration, there were just so many instances of state capture. You recall how state resources were used to finance private interests, particularly if one is to think about a prominent personality in history such as Cecil John Rhodes in terms of the role that they play. You can even think about the Paul Kruger administration. You can even come back just before the dawn of democracy in 1994, where in anticipation of black government, we've seen many instances of looting of the state resources, of corruption. And also even when you go back to the liberation movements in terms of the things that happened when they were out of the country, there were just so many instances of corruption. So the point that I'm trying to make is that corruption appears to be an inherent character of the evolution of the state. And now the question that we are confronted with is, how do we deal with this phenomena? Perhaps we need to go back beyond the laws that we are passing, beyond the institutions that we are building. Perhaps we need to go back and try to look at how we can, from the very beginning, shape the moral character of the society.
You know, Professor Herbert, let me come in here because I don't want to lose this connection. Well, once again, thanks for still being there for us. Quickly, I'd like you to close on this before I come back to Nigeria, to Oluwadare. Now, you've just taken it to the angle which will ultimately interest every African. How can the continent, looking at South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, and a couple of other places, how can the continent deal with the fight, or I mean, deal with the problem, rather, of corruption?
I think we need to go back and assign, particularly institutions of learning, a very direct responsibility, and remind them that their responsibility is not just only to teach kids for the purpose of being engaged by the market, for the purpose of ultimately participating in any economic activity. We need to emphasize that one of the fundamental purposes of education, it should be to recreate society. In other words, education should also be used for the purpose of character formation. Because in many instances, when we take kids to our university, we tend to lose this important part, which ought to be the fundamental character of education, which is to mold the moral character of the very same people that we are creating through our institutions. In other words, we need to look at our universities or any other learning institution as an opportunity to recreate society. So all what I'm trying to say is that let's teach, let's make sure that issues of ethical orientation becomes a prominent feature in our curriculum. And also we need to start with that from the very beginning, from the kindergarten, from the primary, from the secondary level, wherein we need to inculcate in the mind of these young people that to take something that doesn't belong to you is wrong, is unacceptable. It must never ever be tolerated. I think
you've touched on something very key here, which I hope many Africans watching will actually key into, and that is the family unit, which you just touched on, and talking about even as far back to kindergarten level, inculcating in these very young ones, these great future leaders, that teaching them what's bad is bad and what's good is good. Professor Herbert, many thanks for your time, and we do hope we should be able to do this again here. And on that day, we should be able to get your video connection up and running. Many thanks. Quickly coming to close this here in Nigeria with Oluwadare. Listening to Professor Herbert, one key thing he's raised, he took it to his area of expertise, area of operation, the education sector, where he said, well, teaching and learning are key things to help in the fight against corruption. If we can do this in a minute, what are those other things your body, SEREP, has been able to put down in its advocacy plan, in speaking to people on how best to fight this ugly scourge?
Thank you very much. Without prejudice to the role of social norms in correcting ills in the society, I would say that has been overemphasized. The incentive still lies with government, and that is why morality and governance, of course, are not the same and should never blend. The idea that as far as morality will go with governance is to set an example. So the people are doing enough as it is, I must tell you, and SERAP is doing a lot to our citizens. What we need to do is the government building institutions, setting examples by doing what is right. If the political will to do so is there and it's done, I really don't believe there is much to demand from citizens any longer.
Well, Oluwadare, Kolawole, many thanks. I hope we should be able to do this again. It's something that we must stay on, from time to time, looking to doing, this for the continent. I'd like to thank you and Professor Herbert for your time. It's a fine place to stop on the show today, as we hope that the fight against corruption is comprehensively won by Africans and African governments. So while fighting corruption may be dangerous, leaving corruption to exist foments trouble for our society. Again, thank you all for being there. See you tomorrow.